Hello, my name is Andy Stevens. I am the author of a book called Home is Where the Hell Is. And I'm going to start with the story, The Root of All Evil. Here's Chapter 1. September 25th, 2001. Deep in the heart of Somerset County, New Jersey, there was an unnamed rooming house, just about a block away from some rather luxurious 2- and 3-bedroom homes in the $100,000 price range. Places the more well-to-do members of society called home. But this rooming house was built for low-income residents, and it looked it. It had a grand total of 35 rooms, 4 of which had private bathrooms, and another 2 had a sink and toilets. All the other tenants had to share a bathroom, and many of them showed little or no consideration for the other tenants. Some would forget to flush the toilet. Some would forget to clean out the sink after shaving, and others would still leave garbage strewn all over the floor. The landlord wasn't very particular about who lived there, and he never bothered to check if there was maybe an outstanding arrest warrant or if any tenants had extensive criminal histories. One tenant was arrested 3 years previous and spent 6 months at Northern Jersey State Prison for possession of nearly a pound of high-grade cocaine, but his lawyer got his sentence reduced, and he won an early release for good behavior. Another tenant spent a year at the same prison for aggravated mayhem. He beat his wife so badly during an argument that she required 3 months of hospitalization and is still unable to use her left arm. Another tenant belonged to a street gang in New York City, but ran afoul of the gang's leader and his rules, and is now hiding out here in central New Jersey. And the list goes on and on. But there are some nice tenants here as well. Mabel and George Allen, both retired and married for 35 years, now living on their Social Security pensions. Alan Hall, a part-time jazz musician, and Eric Foster, a construction worker, currently working on the new Sheraton Hotel on Route 22 in Bridgewater, whose life consisted mainly of eating, working, and sleeping. He was usually too tired to make any noise. Although they were as different as night and day, they all had one thing in common. Like most people, their whole lives practically revolved around money. They got into fights over money, and there was never quite enough of it to go around. Some of them owed a significant amount of credit card debt, anywhere between $5,000 and $10,000 worth, and they were searching frantically for a way out of it. It was money they were seeking, and it was money they would get. On the morning of September 26th, Mabel and George Allen woke up to just about their usual time. They went to the kitchen to make themselves a simple breakfast of oatmeal and bananas. No sooner did George set the box of instant oatmeal down on the counter when a rather bizarre sight caught their eyes. Sitting on top of the kitchen table was at least 100 neatly wrapped bundles of cash, totaling over $1 million. They just stopped what they were doing and looked over at this wondrous sight for a few minutes, not initially knowing how to react. They had never seen so much money in all their lives. They were wondering if Santa Claus had paid an early visit to their rooming house, or maybe some multi-millionaire had felt generous and decided to leave the money for the poor, financially straddled residents. Mabel walked over and pulled a bundle away and put it in the pocket of her bathrobe. After they ate their breakfast, they went back into their rooms. They took 2 bundles, or $10,000, enough money to last them for the next year, maybe longer. 8:05 a.m. Wayne Derringer, a foreman for Johnson & Brothers Construction, and his wife, Carrie, woke from their deep slumber and headed for the kitchen. They, too, couldn't believe their eyes. Like the Allens, they thought the Lord had performed some kind of miracle. Wayne was seriously contemplating bankruptcy. He had 7 credit cards and owed at least $3,000 on each of them. He misunderstood the concept of credit and, as such, had driven himself very deeply into debt. Carrie owed money on about 3 credit cards. Her debts totaled about $9,000, and she was seriously considering taking out a consolidation loan to pay off these creditors. He helped himself to 4 of the bundles, or $20,000. He figured it would be enough to at least pay off a significant portion of the debt. He then took a shower and headed off to work. Wayne took $12,000 and gave $8,000 to Carrie, who deposited it into her checking account. Alan Hall was just barely getting by on his meager paycheck. He could barely pay even the most basic living expenses. There wasn't a whole lot of booking for his jazz band, the Alan Hall Quartet, and he had a hard time finding even the most low-paying jobs. Even the local McDonald's wasn't hiring at this time. There was still about $800,000 sitting on the kitchen table, and without hesitation, he grabbed a stack of $20,000 in crisp, clean $100 bills. Like the other tenants, he had bills to pay too, and he also thought this was some kind of miracle from heaven. David Wilcox was a gas station attendant who worked at the Hess station on Route 22 and made only $6.50 an hour, barely enough to even pay his basic living expenses. His eyes remained fixated on the cash for about 5 minutes, and he began wrestling with his conscience. He first thought that, no, this money might belong to somebody. But then he thought that if this were the case, its rightful owners wouldn't just leave it out carelessly, so that anyone could help themselves to it. So he grabbed a stack and took it out to his pickup truck, intending to deposit it when his shift ended at 2 p.m. All in all, a grand total of 20 tenants helped themselves to the money until it was all gone. Chapter 2. George and Mabel Allen. The North Branch Inn was a small, quaint little restaurant nestled in the countryside about a quarter of a mile off Route 22 in the town of North Branch, New Jersey. Mabel and George Allen decided to celebrate their newfound cash windfall by dining here. They had made a reservation for 7 p.m. and were promptly seated. The waiter handed them their menus and took their drink orders. George ordered a mug of his favorite beer, and Mabel just a club soda with a little wedge of lemon. The waiter returned with their drinks, and then he took their food order. Mabel ordered the rack of lamb. Mabel ordered the rack of lamb with a side order of potatoes au gratin and broccoli with butter sauce. George ordered a porterhouse steak, cooked medium rare, garnished with onion rings and a large baked potato, smothered with sour cream and bacon bits. During dinner, the conversation turned to how they would spend the money. Mabel said she'd like to visit her granddaughter in Connecticut, and George, who was an avid fisherman, said he'd like to plan a trip on Lake George in upstate New York, which was kind of on the way to Connecticut. Only 2 of the other tables were occupied, and it was usually slow on a Monday night. George raised his fork and knife and slowly sliced into the steak with an almost surgical skill. George did his best. Mabel was doing her best to separate the meat from the bones, although she was having some difficulty. George did his best to assist her, and they both enjoyed their night out together and their new cash windfall. Suddenly, George snapped his head back, rather violently. Mabel stopped eating and just looked at him rather puzzled. "Are you all right, George?" "Yes, Mabel, I'm fine. I can't understand it." But George Allen wasn't fine. He dropped his utensils on the table. His head snapped back again, and he began squinting his eyes. Mabel was becoming really scared now. "George, what is the matter?" "I don't know, Mabel. I can't figure out what's causing this." The other diners looked over and were becoming concerned. Poor George Allen started going into convulsions. Mabel was now horrified. The waiter came over and asked George if George was all right. No, George wasn't all right and would never be again. He clutched his head and began pulling out chunks of his own hair, all the while screaming like a maniac. Mabel was now frantic. She pleaded with the waiter to call an ambulance, but George was becoming worse. He rose from his chair and he began to rotate around in a circle. He was now pressing his palms against his head, like someone with a severe migraine headache. Mabel simply couldn't believe what she saw next. George's head swelled to about twice its normal size. It was literally blowing up like a balloon. The other diners rose from their chairs and just froze in horror, waiting to see what would happen next. No one was prepared for what happened next. George's head literally exploded into pieces, with pieces of his brain going in one direction, his eyeballs going in the other direction, and some rather large fragments of his skull rushing toward the kitchen, narrowly missing the waiter. Mabel was now covered in George's blood and was screaming in utter terror, but the worst was yet to come. A set of long, glistening legs was emerging from his headless torso, which resembled the legs of a black widow spider. Right above the legs, a head with two large mutant eyes emerged. Poor Mabel Allen didn't have time to run away. The hideous creature drove its long legs through her heart, killing her almost instantly. The others just fled the building, and the manager called the police, to no avail. Chapter 3. Allen Hall. Sandy Hook was a popular fishing spot in central New Jersey. When he wasn't playing gigs with the Allen Hall Quartet, he liked to travel to Sandy Hook and fish about a mile off the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. Today was no exception. Only today he was $20,000 richer. He decided to get the other 3 members of his jazz group and travel the 60-some-odd miles to the beach. Yes, he thought, this was truly a cause for celebration, and if he caught a tuna or striped bass, it would indeed be a perfect day. Halfway to Sandy Hook, Hall and his friends stopped at a liquor store and bought a case of Budweiser. With his fishing boat in tow, the only thought running through Allen's mind was catching the big one. At 6:40 a.m., they finally arrived, loaded up the boat, and proceeded to back it into the water. With everyone in the boat and all the fishing gear loaded in, Allen started the boat's motor and glided it about a mile from the shoreline. It's often been said that the further you go into the ocean, the better your chances are of catching fish, and the bigger those fish will be. Allen considered that sage advice. They were now about a mile from anything resembling land, and everyone prepared their poles. Allen used some live bait he purchased from Joe's General Store in Atlantic Highlands. And his friends used glowworms and superbait, a putty-like substance rumored to be very effective in catching some of the larger fish, like tuna. Allen took a beer out of the dark blue cooler in the middle of the boat and offered his friends one, which they readily accepted. The plan was to spend the morning on the water, then to head back to shore and have lunch at the Sand Point Inn and Restaurant in Atlantic Highlands, which had some of the best seafood on the New Jersey shore, or so the local residents would tell you. Allen and his friends just sat patiently and sipped their beers, waiting for the fish to bite. It was now 7:40 a.m. Allen made it a point to get on the water real early, around 7 a.m., not only to beat the crowd, but to improve his chances of catching the big one. They would catch the big one, all right. It was now exactly 8 o'clock. Off in the distance, Alan saw what appeared to be some rather large fins protruding from the surface of the water. Sharks, Alan thought to himself. But the only type of sharks in these waters were the small ones. The larger ones, like the great white, were found around Florida and the Bahamas, but never on the Jersey coast. Those fins were rapidly approaching the boat, and Alan Hall immediately sensed that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. He started the motor and ordered everyone to take their lines out of the water. He started sweating profusely and felt a sudden chill. He attempted to maneuver the boat back to shore, but suddenly the sharks, a whole school of great whites, surrounded it. When Alan turned the motor up full speed in order to get away, one of the sharks rammed the side of the boat, almost capsizing it. Alan tried again to get away from those monster fish, but again his boat was rammed, this time from in front. The boat made a 180-degree turn into the water, and the cooler and 2 boxes of fish lures fell out into the water, and the 4 would-be fishermen were now consumed with terror. Alan was now desperately trying to maintain control of the boat